Are you good? Are you still hungry for good news? Are you still hungry for discuss and listen to interesting people? You're not tired? Good, good. So, my friends, how do you feel about the old lament that Europe is falling behind in innovation and it simply cannot keep up with China and the US? It's getting a bit tiring, doesn't it? Doesn't it? So let's take to the opportunities that Europe has to become a global leader in future technologies. We heard in some sessions already about this, but now we deepen it. We're very happy to have a stellar panel of experts with us who can tell us where these opportunities lie and what we need to do to make the most out of them. Please welcome Anne Mettler, a true expert in European innovation, technology, and industrial policy. Anne is currently a distinguished visiting fellow at Columbus University Center on Global Energy Policy. Carl Benedict Frey, an award-winning economist at the University of Oxford and author of the new book, How Progress Ends. How Progress Ends, which he will present in a separate session on Saturday. Make sure not to miss that. And Andreas Urschütz, member of the management board and chief marketing officer of Infineon Technologies, a world leader in semiconductor solutions. And the distinguished journalist John Thornhill of the Financial Times, who will moderate this panel discussion. Welcome, everyone. What an outstanding group of bright minds.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Steffi. It's great to be back at DLD again and to get in touch with my wild side, which only happens very rarely. And delighted to be moderating this session, Europe, a global leader in future tech. And I note that the title is a question, not a statement. But by the end of this session, I want to make sure that we have erased the question mark and made clear what needs to be done to make sure that Europe really is a global leader in future tech. And we have three excellent panelists who have extensive public and private sector experience and academic firepower to provide these answers. I'm determined to start and end on a positive note. And Andreas, I'm going to start with you. When we think of the semiconductor industry, we tend to think of the giant US, Taiwanese, Korean, and Chinese firms. But Infineon has shown that a European company can compete in certain sectors of the semiconductor market. How's that possible?
Whenever reading newspapers, you're getting that impression like, the world of chip makers is being dominated by Taiwanese and American players. This goes back to the reality that, in particular in the area of central processing units, but also GPUs, so machine learning chips, Taiwanese foundries are supporting American chip makers, if you will, and that is what you very often read. What you rarely read in the newspaper is, however, that the overall semiconductor market is split along 5 major product segments, 2 of which are the CPUs and GPUs, that's what we read. The other 3 are microcontrollers, power electronics, and sensors. So in these 3 areas, Europe is the one who has a play. So when you look into these 3 areas and count together, the market share and the market positioning of the major European ones, which are Infineon, ST Microelectronics, Bosch, NXP, and a handful of others, all of a sudden you see more than 50% market share of all microcontrollers of planet Earth are done, produced, developed, and delivered mostly out of Europe. More than 30% of global market share in power semiconductors stems from Europe, and over 40% market share in the area of sensors. So you can also put it the other way around, unless innovation, but also production from Europe in these three areas takes place and is being shipped into China, shipped into America, shipped to the rest of the world, including Europe, the world would be standing still. So having said that, we have a fundamental strong foothold in microelectronics, and we have to do a lot going forward, including public policy making, in order to expand in that sector.
Okay, well, that's all great to hear in your particular sector. What other areas in Europe would you point to that where Europe can lead globally?
Look, the point is as follows. When you, for instance, look into what currently happens in Europe and in Germany in terms of technological focal points, I just was recently reading about this high-tech agenda of Germany as one example. And when I look deeper into that one, I realized there are 18 billion euro put together by the government, by the federal government in Germany, and that is meant to be spent in the next 4 years, split into 7 different sectors. One of which is the AI, another one is microelectronics, biotechnology, quantum computing, and a few other ones. Remember the figure of 18 times 4 years. When you today, in the here and now, look into one of these sectors like artificial intelligence and look what the Americas is spending, just the big 4 companies that are operating AI machine learning models and deploying big time then also data centers whose name is Google, Meta, Microsoft, and also Amazon, they together in 2026 intend to spend 400 billion in the AI. That is bolstered by another 500 billion promise of the Trump administration to kind of second from public policy making just in the area of AI. So 18 divided by 7 divided by 4, that's what we spend, versus these 600, 700, 800 billion blocks on the other hand side. So having said that, looking into Europe, looking into Germany, we have a massive issue in terms of then also putting specific focus in where and what technologies going forward we intend to be leading, and also bolster in both directions private investment, companies, but then also public policy making and public investment in order to truly scale. Now you ask me, what else than microelectronics would make a lot of sense? It's a bunch of things. From my perspective, I believe Europe, to a large degree, is left behind in the area of foundational AI and deploying data centers for machine learning and AI modeling, if you will. We are not left behind in applied AI, just to give another example. What is applied AI? Use large language models and use them, for instance, in the context of manufacturing automation. Okay. That would be an area where I strongly believe Europe could count on to, Germany could count on to, in order to proliferate and take a strong stance going forward beyond semiconductors and microelectronics.
All right. I very much want to come back to that as a subject. Anne, I want to come to you now. So we've been hearing that in some sectors, Europe can absolutely compete globally in tech. We have world-class researchers. We've got an incredibly vibrant startup community. And we theoretically have a market of 450 million people that can spur this demand. So where is the problem, in your view?
Yeah. So thank you so much. I wouldn't know where to start when I talk about the problems, but I'll mention some of them. So yes, we are decent when it comes to early stage innovation. I think everyone knows that. However, I think that in and of itself has become problematic because that basically turns us into an incubator for the world. Why? Because we don't scale in Europe. We really have an absolutely pathetic track record. There isn't, Europe has not produced a single deep tech startup that is listed in Europe and has a market cap above 100 billion euros in more than 50 years. 50 years. This despite the sizable single market that you mentioned. And for a long time, and I say it as a previous Director General at the European Commission, for a long time we sort of thought, okay, only the Americans can do this in digital tech. When I came into the Commission in 2014, we described China as a developing country. By the time I left in 2019, we referred to it as a systemic competitor. 5 years. And so I won't mention here the Magnificent Seven because some of them have already been mentioned in the United States, but I wanted to just list a couple of the companies, really sizable global players that China has produced in the last 50 years. Tencent, Alibaba, JD.com, CATL, BYD, ByteDance / TikTok, Shein, Temu, Huawei, Baidu, Geely, Lenovo, Energy, Mingyang, Goldwyn, and Vision. So someone tell me this isn't possible? Why can others do what we can't do if we are so good? And this is now not only really an seismic economic problem, it's turning out to be an existential security problem and challenge. Because this is not easy to fix. You lose the technology frontier, it's not easy to regain. So I want to come here in a discussion on innovation with really a great sense of urgency. Just fiddling around the edges will not do this time. Because this is we're in a really serious spot. Hyper-dependent both on US tech and Chinese tech. And there may be some areas where we are still competitive, I don't deny that. However, there's nothing that tells us we'll still be competitive in 5 or 10 years. I'm sure the German automotive makers also thought they were really competitive until they weren't anymore. So let's not be complacent. Let's really feel the pressure and the urgency to do things differently going forward.
That's a devastating critique of where we stand at the moment. But what do you think we ought to do about it? Sorry. No, and could you come back on that and then I can go?
This is as easy as the question is, what is the problem? So the first thing is, I mean, let's not do what we have been doing because it obviously doesn't solve the issue, right? And I mean, sitting in Brussels, I have to say, quite a bit we have to do differently because the tendency to regulate before we're even in the game needs to stop, right? I mean, we need to really become players and not just see every risk, but also the opportunities. And the fragmentation of the single market is a huge problem. So you have over-regulation plus fragmented markets, and you have stagnation by design. You really do. And we have, proven track record for that. Europe, on balance, is way too complex. I say it to someone, I tried to get digital tech off the ground for 20 years, 20 years. And then at the end of the Juncker Commission, I said, I've had enough of this. I'm going into clean tech because I knew that the Green Deal was coming and Europe, this was going to play to our strength. We were going to do it. I spent almost 6 years trying to scale clean tech across the EU, and it left me utterly frustrated because the complexity that these poor companies face dealing with the regional level, because when you're in energy, by definition, you got to build something. So you're dealing with regional authorities for permits, et cetera. Then you deal with national level, because that's where you have, the labor provisions and the taxation. And then usually in energy, you need a subsidy because, this is just a fact. So then you're dealing with Brussels, right? You're dealing with DG competition. No startup can manage this complexity, which is why I said when the Americans came out with the Inflation Reduction Act, Europe needs a Complexity Reduction Act urgently. This is not a joke.
No. But coming back to this China example, which intrigues me, as much as I agree that Europe has a complexity issue, Europe has a productivity problem as a consequence of this. Capital market fragmentation leading to then also lower labor productivity relative to the US, for instance. I just recently read that in 2023, US productivity was 24 percentage points higher as compared to Europe. I must say I was shocked, and there is a lot of explanation that has to do with capital markets fragmentation, with higher factor cost, with over-bureaucracy, with slow permit processes, and so on and so forth. But coming back to the China element, I believe there's two more which are worth mentioning. where I believe we have to put our hands onto with much more decisiveness. One of which is, when you look into China, there has always been strategic planning for sectors such as the electromobility, since you mentioned BYD. So there is a 10, 20-year long-term planning, and like Deng Xiaoping is saying, hide your strengths and then wait after having set a target. So consequently work towards a target over many, many, many years over a long period of time and see where China ultimately has got. And beyond this one, I'm also wondering this whole element of culture and attitude. So when I look into the surrounding, I'm very often then, in particular in also economic but political elite circles, if you allow me to say, surrounded by pessimism and anything else but a can-do attitude. And here's the decisive difference going forward. So Europe, and thus a large part of those guys who are decision-making in Europe, have got complacent, if you will, and there is also a big degree of fear to let go. There's more fear to lose because we have gained a lot. So we have been ascending over 80 years after World War II, and we have got a lot of, so to say, richness or prosperity which we intend to defend. Okay. But as a function of this, then coming to the point and courageously taking these new steps, courage in a world that is being newly ordered. So I'm talking about this new multipolar world order, which is happening. That takes a culture, that takes a state in mind, an attitude, which is more towards can-do, being decisive, and then standing it for it, and getting the society included and go over many, many years instead of tactical planning versus strategic target setting in China.
Okay. Carl, I want to bring you in here. We've heard a relatively optimistic take. We've heard a pessimistic take. Where do you stand in this debate? What needs to be done?
So I think if you go back to the 2000s, there was a sense that China was going to become like the United States. I think if you look back in the rearview mirror, it looks more like the United States becoming more like China. And that should, I think, make us feel rather uncomfortable. First of all, China's productivity growth has been dismal over the past decades, by many estimates even in negative territory since the Great Recession. China's GDP per capita is plateauing at levels which is about a fifth of the US economy in GDP per capita terms, much lower than South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, previous growth miracles. And I think there's a sense in Europe that we're being squeezed. We're being squeezed by China. We're being squeezed by the US, which is also taking a more techno-nationalistic approach. And therefore, we need to do the same. And I think if you go back and look at the historical record, it is true that America has had some successes in industrial policy. The Manhattan Project did produce the bomb before Germany did. The Rad Lab did advanced radar technology. The Apollo project put a man on the moon. But those projects do not account for American prosperity. American productivity growth started to surge already in the 1920s. It then collapsed during World War II on any measure, whether you look at patents, whether you look at productivity, whether you look at scientific publications. Innovation doesn't flourish during times of war. And the reason is simple. You can see the innovations that emerge from the war machine. You can see the advancements in radar technology. What you don't see is the resources that are being channeled into that from something else. That's the unseen. And the unseen is very important too. Now, I'm not going to deny that Europe has had some industrial policy successes of its own. Airbus is one. But we also had a lot of industrial policy failures in semiconductors. For example, there's been various initiatives on the national level which didn't succeed. What's the difference? I think a key difference is that in aircraft technology, the industry was fairly static when Airbus was created. The jet engine had already been developed, and so you were catching up to a relatively static target. Semiconductors is different because it's a moving target, and AI is very different because it's a very rapidly moving target. We don't know if the future of AI is large language models, if small language models, is it some fusion with symbolic AI, is it something else? We don't know. And the only way of finding out is investing in different approaches, hedging your bets, and seeing what ends up catching on. And I believe that is the approach that Europe needs to take. Now, to be clear, it's not so surprising, maybe, that Europe is not leading in digital. What it's more surprising is that it's also failing to catch up with the frontier, because that's something that Europe has managed well in the past. It did so in manufacturing industries during the post-war period, but it's failed in ICT. And so we ought to ask ourselves why. And I think a key reason for that is that while the single market is reasonably harmonized in goods, far from perfect, but reasonably harmonized, we don't have a single market for services. And so what the United States and China have in common is that they both have large domestic markets which are relatively harmonized that you can scale into. Europe doesn't have that, and so the IMF estimates that if you take all barriers to trade within the European Union and you add them up, they amount to something like 110% tariff. So Trump Liberation Day tariffs self-imposed within the European Union. And so what should be done? A key priority should be harmonizing the single market for services. Another key priority, and here I think we can actually learn something from China, because they have been tremendously successful in catching up in AI by embracing open source. There's no reason that Europe could not do the same. And so you don't necessarily need to be the leader in large language models. It's enough to be a fast follower, and China has proven that. And then rather going all in on language models, Europe can sow many different seeds and look for different approaches to AI, which might be more fruitful going forward. Because I think it's fair to say that the scaling paradigm that we've seen over the past 10 years or so, it is gradually running into diminishing returns, and we are looking at a new paradigm for research. And so how do you make Europe a really excellent research hub? I think it's an important question. And I don't really agree that Europe is doing really well in innovation. Most talent is still, despite what's going on, going to the United States. And the key reason for that is that American research institutions are just much better funded. And they have more autonomy to set salaries and other things which do matter. Other things matter too for where talent settles. And so when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a lot of talent in the Soviet Union. Where did those people go? To places with lower marginal tax rates. And that's also something that we need to look at in Europe.
But learning from what you're just saying, talking about the China example and translating into Europe, would you agree that in the era of innovation, other than talent attraction of the very top, that also this element of investment, so is there enough investment? Are we underinvested in innovation in Europe?
So I think it depends on what you mean in which stage, right? And so clearly, there is a need for Germany and many other countries to update critical infrastructure, for example, that is essential to innovation, both in digital and in old industries. But if you're investing in research, it's actually not that so much a question of funding. You could do a lot, even in AI, with not so much funding in terms of trying to figure out if something works to begin with or not. So I don't think it's a question of just marshalling resources and channeling them into one field. And what China has done quite successfully in solar, in EVs, in many other domains, it's actually not that different from what Japan is doing. It's focused on process innovation and reducing costs to market, just achieving economies of scale.
But in particular, in this example of EV, what China was doing from my perspective was that they have been, by public policy in the 2010s to 2020s, fully supporting the entire technology stack, so from producing polysilicon up to the solar panel, including all the electronics around, and this was supported by huge, massive amount of capital, whilst so to say, invented in Germany, solar industry was going under because of, so to say, subsidization systems being associated to that very segment in Europe, and financing was left out. So there was bankruptcy while scaling in China. So I believe it was more.
So China's industrial policy is very poorly understood, and most of it is local. It's become more centralized around Beijing in recent years, but the successes have been provinces competing against each other. And so it's pro-competitive industrial policy. Europe is not going to be able to replicate that. Channeling resources into some of Europe's legacy firms is not going to, by any stretch of the imagination, replicate the Chinese model. Nor is it desirable in most instances either. And so I think we should, stop looking so much at what's going on to China and look more at ourselves and what can we do over here to restart growth and innovation.
On that subject, I mean, Anne, you were talking about we need to have a sense of urgency in Europe in order to respond. One area you could argue where that is happening is in security and defense at the moment, for obvious reasons, both the terrible war in Ukraine, but also the harsh rhetoric that's coming out of the US. To what extent are you convinced that there is a sense of urgency in promoting defense tech, and is that an opportunity for a kind of new military Keynesianism? Is there a new way of promoting innovation in defense?
Before I answer that, I want to say something about the China question, because it's important. I always like to quote Deng Xiaoping, who said in 1992, the Middle East has oil, we have critical minerals. So they thought early on, what is our competitive advantage and disadvantage? China is like Europe, an energy-poor, a resource-poor geography. They don't have oil and gas, same as us, right? So they knew we can't compete in a combustion engine car, neither would it be in our interest. So they thought of an entirely new car, an electric car. Seemed like a moonshot at the time. What do you need for an electric car? You need a battery. What do you need for a battery? You need cobalt. Where do you get cobalt? In the Democratic Republic of Congo. Then how do you scale this thing? You use your own market. You close off the market. You really strategically use your market to unleash enormous competition between companies. What does competition do? It drives up productivity and lowers the cost. So in that sense, China took the best of capitalism, but reserved it only for itself, and left us with all the dysfunctional parts, with the quarterly reportings, with wanting to buy cheap because we cannot strategically invest for the long run, right? So there is something that we have to learn before we now go into a situation with the rearmament of Europe, where we will again spend hundreds of billions of euros on this and that, just like we did with digital tech, with close to nothing to show for. The same as we did with clean tech. When the Green Deal was announced, it was said, we're going to spend €1 trillion over the next decade. We're now 6 years into it. We have nothing to show for. Okay, we bought a lot of Chinese solar panels, but in our own wind industry almost collapsed. Our battery industry / Northvolt, one company, collapsed. Green hydrogen was, the holy grail to decarbonization, never got off the ground. What the hell are we doing?
Yeah.
If we repeat this in defense tech, we're dead. I mean, we're finished.
You are saying,
just briefly.
You are saying it because when you look into... I want to echo what you are saying. So, because here and there, meeting people who are saying, so since the automotive sector, as one example, is losing in terms of GDP contribution going forward, there might be a defense technology in Europe, in Germany, that's going to pick it up. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a myth. when you look into the reality and look into military and defense applications and the global market for that kind of things, then in 2025, this market used to be around $700 billion in size. Remember 700. If you look into where is the value added and the manufacturing of all this stuff happening, then out of the top 100 companies in the defense sector, more than 60% reside in the US. Only 3 major companies out of the top 100 reside in Germany. Whilst the US companies take more than 60% of the share, the top 3 German companies in the top 100 take lesser than 4 percentage points of this cake. So having said that, if you just imagine the number of 700 billion, and in that regards, the example goes towards Germany taking somewhat like lesser than 4 percentage points, in terms of additional value add, there's not so much to bring on the table in terms of building new working places, employment, and prosperity. So as a matter of fact, when we build up military, which I'm not denying is of an importance for the continent, the guys who are benefiting from that is Mr. Trump in the morning and Mr. Putin in the afternoon. And why Putin? Putin is himself probably now having a celebration because whilst we are spending, like in Germany, over 70 billion annual budget into defense as such, this is also money which on the other hand is missing in order to build economical strength in future technology. And that is exactly the reason why there's only a leftover of 18 billion for 4 years, for 7 sectors. Nothing in order to scale up and pump up sectors where we going forward want to grow prosperity and thus also geopolitical importance in a multipolar world order.
Carl, you wanted to come in?
Europe certainly has some very significant growth problems. But let's stop looking to China for inspiration, please. Chinese GDP per capita is a fifth of US GDP per capita, and it's flatlining. Productivity for the past 15 years, flatlined. Dynamism in China, flatlined, okay? If you build an airport in the middle of nowhere and a city emerges around it, you look like a genius. If you build an airport in the middle of nowhere and not a single house is built, you look like an idiot. China, today, a third of the economy is real estate. It's massively overbuilt. That means that you can find examples where China planned ahead of time, built an airport, and the city emerged. Amazing, planning works. But in the other cases, where buildings are standing empty, it didn't work. And the result is flatlined growth. And so, yes, let's look to our own problems. Let's try to fix them. But the model for European prosperity is not China.
Carl, you wrote a book recently called How Progress Ends, which was shortlisted for the FT Business Book of the Year Award, in which you say that centralized bureaucratic management is most advantageous for exploiting low-hanging technological fruit and spearheading technological catch-up, but decentralized systems are better for exploring new technological trajectories. And that seems to me quite important for where we are in Europe at the moment. Are we, do you think, in the process of catch-up, in which case we need more centralized direction, we need more Europe, as it were, or do we need to decentralize, liberate the private sector in order to remain at the frontier of technology?
So unfortunately, I don't think Europe is doing particularly well in either. And so Europe definitely has a scaling problem, and harmonizing the single market is a big part of the solution to that. Europe also has an entry problem. And so dynamism is lacking. Regulations like the GDPR hasn't helped. By any estimate, it's hurt small and young firms. It hasn't really hurt larger enterprises that manage to capture a larger share of the market to offset compliance costs. So we need to reduce regulatory burdens for smaller firms. Labor laws, unfortunately, do mean that, in the US, Meta and Google can pivot, they can hire and fire when a new technology like generative AI emerges. In Europe, we can't really do that. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should roll back our commitments on the welfare state. In fact, I think we should double down on them and probably embrace something that's closer to the kind of flexicurity that you have in Denmark, genuine labor market flexibility and actual security. And so not all that Europe is doing is wrong, but it can do a lot more to aid startups by reducing regulations, to attract talent by giving universities and research institutions more autonomy, and most importantly, harmonizing the single market in services.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Anne? Do we need more Europe or less Europe?
We need a different Europe. And it pains me to say it, I've spent my entire career on the EU. This Europe is not fit for purpose. There was a session earlier today where someone even talked, will the EU still exist in 10 years? But what I need to tell you is the EU has to exist because every single member state, including a big one like Germany, will fail on its own. Personally, I think we need two things. We need a new balance between public and private. Because if I look at sort of what is working in the world, and here I disagree a little bit on that China is not, something to follow. China is leading the technology frontier now more often than not, even in comparison to the United States. Europe's not even in the game anymore. And it's time that we don't only look at this from an economic perspective. These are now issues of sovereignty, of self-determination, of being able to preserve our system of governance. I mean, this is how serious this is, because the world is in a competition for technology supremacy. There will be this is a zero-sum game, If China wins quantum and AI, we're finished. I mean, you can forget about living the life that you're leading now. So what I'm saying is we have sort of the US system, laissez-faire, we let the private sector do. We have the Chinese, which is a masterclass in policy planning, and then we have some really strange hybrid here in Europe, where we have a very powerful public sector that knows close to nothing about business or innovation or scaling or risk-taking or entrepreneurship, calling all the shots. Yeah, so really dominant. We really need to understand, in most of our countries, the state is 50% of GDP. They're calling all the shots. They're setting the framework for something they not only know nothing about, but most people really have no interest in. I mean, I've been in Brussels 25 years. Now we wake up to, we have a competitiveness problem. Duh. It took you this long to understand. There have been people warning for ages, but no one wanted to hear because we were so self-involved with all of these wonderful things of how we were going to rescue the world. It's not happening. So, we need a new balance between public and private. We need to dare to unleash entrepreneurial power. It will be disruptive. It will be very different from what we are used to. But it's, in my opinion, the only way forward. Because the way we've been doing it, so we know what doesn't work. So why is it so hard to do it differently? It's because those that have the power to change still don't understand that we have an existential problem.
In the last 80 years, Europe has unleashed that entrepreneurial power twice incredibly effectively. In the post-war era, there was extraordinary kind of catch-up with America. And then in post the Soviet Union's collapse, we had the catch-up in Eastern Europe as well. These were miraculous periods of economic convergence and growth.
That's when we fell asleep, if I can say that, because we thought we had won.
So what do we need to have a third economic miracle?
Well, I thought the only silver lining I ever saw in the Ukraine war was that it would finally really kick us in the ass and really get us into action. I worked in energy, and it's been heartbreaking to see that the very thing that was weaponized against us, natural gas, which at the height of the energy crisis was 8 times as expensive as before the war. I remember saying at a conference, at this rate, we will lose our industry not in a matter of years, but in a matter of weeks, because you cannot be competitive if your price of energy is 8 times what it was before the war. What did we do? We built LNG terminals really quickly. Huh? Europe used more natural gas in 2024 than we did before the war started. It's insanity. What we needed was a green Manhattan project, because clean energy is not just for decarbonization. This is a matter of existential importance for our security, sovereignty, and resilience. Why did we not use this opportunity? We spent hundreds of billions subsidizing fossil energy and natural gas in particular. What is Putin paying his war with?
And what could we have done instead with all these hundreds of millions in terms of scaling other important sectors? But while everybody would agree here in this room in terms of we need, in that regards, disruptive systemic change going forward, I wonder whether is there anything in place in terms of where we intend to head. So in other words, do we have something?
No.
Are you aware of something like Vision 2040 for Europe? Europe 2040?
So when the war started, I spoke to the CEO of Siemens Energy, because we served in a group at the Munich Security Conference, and I said, we got to quickly do something. So we started an energy resilience leadership group where we looked at what are the sectors where we use the most natural gas, and what are clean technologies we can scale today that are really ready to scale, we can invest in, so we can get off natural gas. We had Ursula von der Leyen, Robert Habeck, we had everyone at the launch, yeah? But it doesn't translate into action. Europe has an implementation, an operationalization problem.
And has this to do with the commonality of attitude and fear to let go?
Let go of what? I gladly let go of natural gas.
That is the point. We are about to be left behind. So as a matter of fact, there is only one way. That is the way forward. But therefore, we have to take certain risk and allocate attention, and in particular, and also energy and funds, if you will, from the private sector, but also from the public sector, towards a couple of things where we jointly believe into we want to be on top in 2040.
But can I say what this necessitates is that you have a public sector that cares to know where the technology frontier lies. Because if you don't know, you cannot fund, you cannot regulate for it. And frankly, my experience is that just way too many people in the public sector are totally complacent. It's much easier to subsidize LNG than to stand up a new technology, I'm sorry to say. And that's why I'm saying we need a new balance between public and private. The public sector needs to enable, not control.
All right, we are very nearly out of time. And this has been a really fascinating and very passionate debate, which I've thoroughly enjoyed. But I'm going to challenge all of you to come up with one recommendation you think that we could make Europe fit for purpose, to use Anne's term. Carl, very briefly.
If we wanted to do Chinese industrial policy, the first thing that we need to do is to create a one-party system in Europe. And then Merz becomes provincial governor of Germany, Macron provincial governor of France, Scholz is provincial governor of Spain. You get the picture. And then you get all these localities to compete against each other on different industrial policy initiatives. Chinese progress is not any master plan whatsoever. Beijing started off in the Deng Xiaoping area to pursue a top-down industrial policy. In 1992, Deng goes to the south. He sees what's happened in the special economic zones that started opening up. Firms set up in Beijing begin moving down south. This was not a plan. This was something that surprised Deng himself.
So you're not answering the question.
And so what Europe needs to do is first getting rid of the idea that we should pursue Chinese-style industrial policy and focus on harmonizing the single market.
Okay, all right. So we don't want a one-party state. We want to harmonize the market. And
minus coalitions of the willing. My experience is there are always some in Europe that get it. Empower them. Let them go and really succeed and be the pioneers that we need them to be, rather than the sort of lowest common denominator with everyone. That's a recipe for disaster.
Great. Andreas, you have the last word.
While the operationalization of what I'm saying will take a lot of effort, pain, sweat, and blood, true leadership at the end, where have all the leaders gone? For me, the answer to the question is not that complex. First, in Europe, we need to get to a joint picture of our aspired future. What does Europe as a continent want to be in the new world of a multipolar world order? Out of that, we have to break down what are strategic targets, what are strategic innovations that we must put our resources onto. And here comes the point. What we are today doing is we put our money into many, many, many baskets. A little bit of everything, but nothing really at scale. So going forward, we have to do what every company, what every entrepreneur is doing, what we as private people at home are doing when we look into our wallet and say, what can we afford? So we choose a few battle places, and that's what they have to do. Less is more. We have to go after 3 to 5 basic future technologies, such as microelectronics, such as applied AI, such as autonomous systems. This is where Europe can shine with all the vertical sectors that we are having, like the mechanical engineering, industrial automation, also the car industry, and so on and so forth. But factor 10x, not double down.
All right.
Put our resources into it. And that, last not least, will require one common thing. We need to dare. Dare to decide for what we all know is right and take that path of risk going forward jointly and follow this common vision as a society of becoming, so to say, the world champions in those sectors in a future that looks as we wanted it to become.
Fabulous. Thank you very much to our panelists for a great debate.